Within the pages of this book, there is an older book, one that's been with me for many years. And you probably know it, or at least maybe have heard the name, the Lesser Key of Solomon. It's actually made up of 5 different books, but the part everybody tends to know is the first one, the Ars Goetia. And that's where we find the famous, wonderfully famous 72 spirits of the Brazen Vessel. Now, I've had a relationship with this book for the past getting on 40 years. I think I first read it and encountered it when I was 12. I've worked with it at different times in my life, approached it from different directions, thought I understood it, changed my mind, come back to it again, which is actually probably true of most of the magical books that have stayed with me. I don't think you ever really finish them. You change, and so the book changes with you. And traditionally, of course, the Goetia is presented as a book about spirits, things outside you. You summon them, you constrain them, you protect yourself from them because they're bad. You command them to do whatever it is you're asking them to do, and then you send them away again. That's the basic picture most of us are given when we first encounter the Goetia. But somewhere along the way, I think I began wondering whether there might be another way of reading the whole thing. And I suppose the question that really started it and turned my mind around was quite a simple one. What if I've been reading this backwards? What if these 72 spirits are not simply a catalogue of beings somewhere out there? What if they're also a map of the beautiful and glorious intricacies of the human soul and the possibilities that go with that? And what if the magical work isn't always about getting these things under control and sending them away? What if sometimes it's about recognizing them, meeting them, discovering what they're actually doing, and eventually being able to say, yes, this too belongs to me. Now, before I disappear completely down the wrong mystical rabbit hole, it's probably worth putting a little bit of history underneath all this. The story behind Solomon commanding the spirits is considerably older than the Lesser Key itself. One of the important early texts is the Testament of Solomon, where Solomon receives a ring from the archangel Michael and uses it to compel spirits to work on the building of the temple. But the neat system we know today, the 72 spirits, their hierarchy, their seals, the story of the brass vessel, developed much later. By the 17th century, we have the form preserved in the Lesser Key of Solomon. Arthur Edward Waite later used a phrase for them, which I've always liked because it also reminds me of Catweasel. If you've not seen it or you're not read it, chase it up. The spirits of the Brazen Vessel. It's just something about that just resonates. 72 strange powers sealed inside this enormous vessel because the traditional reading is obvious enough. Solomon has conquered them. He's contained them. He's got dangerous forces safely under control. But the further along my journey I've got, the less interested I've become in that interpretation. I spent too many years exploring what happens when we try to do exactly the same thing to ourselves. And I'm certainly not the first magician to make that connection. Crowley said very plainly in his introduction to the Goetia that these spirits could be understood as portions of the human brain, forces within consciousness that the magician deliberately calls into activity. Regardie, writing a little bit later, moved in a similar direction, viewing magical beings through the lens of complexes and autonomous parts of the psyche. And Milo de Coet, in his wonderfully irreverent way, takes much of the terror out of the whole business. There's a long current within modern magical thought that says perhaps these spirits are not as separate from us as we imagine. And once I began looking at the Goetia through that lens, something rather wonderful happened. The book changed. By that, I mean perhaps I changed, because rather than seeing 72 things I might summon, I started seeing 72 mirrors, 72 ways in which something human might look back at me. And even the number 72 then becomes interesting here, because 72 crops up again and again within the Western mystical tradition. Most famously, of course, we have the 72-fold name of God, the Shem HaMephorash, derived from 3 verses in Exodus. Later magical systems paired those 72 divine names with the 72 goetic spirits, and I find that fascinating because suddenly the simple distinction between the holy thing up there and the demonic thing down here becomes much harder to maintain. You have 72 of these and 72 of those, opposite ends of the same pole, each spirit with its corresponding angelic or divine force, each one somehow reflecting the other. And for me, That points towards something I've found again and again in magical work. Very few forces inherently are one thing. The same energy can save you or destroy you depending upon how it's placed in your life. So let's take anger. Anger can rip through everything you love, but anger can also be the force that finally says enough. It can establish a boundary, protect somebody vulnerable, give you the strength to move when you have tolerated something for far too long. Same fire, different relationship to the fire. And when I look through the descriptions of the Goetic spirits, that's increasingly what I see. Not 72 neat psychological definitions. I think that would be probably far too simplistic. But 72 great patterns of force. And every one of those forces seems capable of expressing itself in more than one way. A force that divides can also distinguish. A force that destroys can clear away what's become stagnant. The instinct that builds walls around you after you've been hurt may eventually leave you lonely and imprisoned. But that same instinct, understood properly, may become the ability to protect what matters and choose carefully who gets close to you. The problem isn't necessarily the energy. The problem is our relationship with it. And this brings me back to that wonderful image of the brazen vessel, because I sometimes wonder whether the story of the vessel describes something human beings are doing all the time. Something arises in us we don't particularly like. So jealousy, fear, desire, anger, pride, whatever it happens to be. And instead of becoming curious about it, we say, that shouldn't be there. So we push it away. We become the respectable version of ourselves, the spiritual version, the kind version, the calm version, the version we're quite happy for everybody else to see. And everything else gets stuffed into the brass pot, lid on, seal it, drop it in the lake, or the unconscious mind. Problem solved. Except, of course, it isn't solved at all, because those parts don't disappear simply because we're stopping looking at them. If anything, they become more powerful. And anybody who's spent any serious amount of time observing themselves will know exactly what I mean. You can decide that you're not an angry person, wonderful, until suddenly you discover that anger has been choosing all sorts of things on your behalf. You can decide you are beyond jealousy, beyond fear, beyond the desire for recognition, and then life has a rather wonderful habit of introducing exactly the person or situation capable of dragging the brazen vessel back out of the lake. And suddenly the lid comes off, everything pours out, and we have a crisis. We think the spiritual work's failed, when perhaps the spiritual work has finally begun. Because now you can actually meet what was there. And I think this is one of the reasons I've become increasingly interested in the wholeness rather than purity. Purity sounds very spiritual. I'm not sure human beings are particularly pure creatures. We're complicated. We love and we resent the same person. We can be courageous one day and frightened the next. We can be astonishingly generous and ridiculously petty. Sometimes within minutes. And strangely enough, I find something sacred in that. Because perhaps spiritual maturity isn't about slowly editing ourselves until only one acceptable bit remains. Perhaps it's about becoming big enough to hold the whole thing. That, for me, is where the Goetia becomes really interesting. Because imagine approaching these 72 spirits in that way. Not asking, how do I protect myself from this? How do I stick it back in the vessel? But where does this live in me? What does it look like when it's unconscious? What does it become when it's brought into awareness? And perhaps most importantly, what gift might be hidden inside it? And that last question has become increasingly important to me. Because very often the things we most dislike about ourselves contain something we desperately need. The person who spent a lifetime trying to not be selfish may need to discover self-interest. The person terrified of their own anger may need its strength. And the person ashamed of wanting recognition may eventually discover a perfectly healthy desire to contribute something meaningful and have that contribution seen. The demon changes when you understand what it's trying to do. Perhaps that is what Solomon represents at its best. Not somebody brutally controlling 72 rebellious monsters, but consciousness sitting at the center of its own kingdom. Every force recognized, every force named, every force given its proper place. because that is what a king does symbolically. The king is the organizing center, not the only thing in the kingdom, the thing around which everything else finds its appropriate relationship. And suddenly, when you look at the Goetia, those strange medieval hierarchies of kings, dukes, princes, presidents, and all the rest of it, begins to suggest something rather different. A properly ordered inner kingdom. Because trouble begins when one part takes the throne. Fear becomes king, or anger, or ambition, or the need to be liked, and then everything else begins organizing itself around that one force. You can build an entire life that way without ever realizing you've done it. And I know I've met people who have, and I've gone down that path myself in the past, more than once. And this is why I don't think the magical path is simply about acquiring more power. Quite often it's about discovering what is already exercising power over you. And that might sound a little less glamorous form of magic, but I suspect it's considerably more useful. Over the years, I've walked through quite a few different traditions and approaches, magic, mysticism, meditation, all sorts, working with the mind, the landscape, turning the ear. Increasingly, I don't see these as separate compartments. They seem to keep bringing me back to the same mystery from different directions. And one of the things I keep finding is that conflict follows separation, especially inner separation. The moment I say this part of me is acceptable, but that part isn't, I've created an internal war. And sometimes, of course, we do need discipline. Magic without discipline quickly becomes indulgence. But discipline and rejection are not the same thing. You can recognize an impulse without obeying it. You can understand anger without throwing a chair through a window. You can meet fear without allowing fear to choose your life. And that to me is very different from pretending those things aren't there. So perhaps the goetic operation can be imagined in another way. You draw the circle, you stand in the center, the spirit appears, and rather than immediately shouting divine names at it and threatening it with internal torment, perhaps you look at it, really look, and say, ah, there you are. What are you? Where do I know you from? Sometimes those meetings are going to be easy. You'll recognize something immediately and think, oh, yeah, of course. I know this one very well. And others, I suspect, will be much harder because there are things about ourselves we genuinely don't want to know. And usually, those are the interesting ones. The places where we recoil, the places where we become defensive, the places where we insist, I'm absolutely not like that. There may actually be a little bit of gold there. Not because every impulse should be indulged, absolutely not, but because every impulse is telling you something about the system it belongs to. And that for me changes the whole flavour of the lesser key. It ceases to merely be a catalogue of demons, it becomes a curriculum in wholeness. 72 encounters, 72 mirrors, and potentially 72 opportunities to discover another part of what it means to be human. The old alchemists would have understood that immediately, I think. Their work was never simply about getting rid of the dark stuff. You work with it, you transform it, you unite what has been divided. Solve et coagula. Thinking of getting that as tattoos, by the way. Let me know what you think. Dissolve and then bring together. And perhaps that is the great work in its deepest sense. Well, I'm pretty sure it is. No, perhaps. Not becoming something human, superhuman, but becoming fully human. Which brings us back to Solomon and the temple, because there's one final image in all of this that I rather love. In the old story, the spirits are put to work building the temple. And normally we imagine Solomon standing there commanding all these external beings to haul enormous stones around Jerusalem. But imagine, just for a moment, reading it inwardly. What if the temple is you? Not the everyday personality with all its preferences and anxieties, but the larger self that can contain all of it. And every one of those strange spirits has something needed for its construction, even the difficult ones, even the ones you'd rather leave sealed in the pot. The temple cannot be completed without them. And maybe that's why there are 72, not 68 acceptable ones, and 4 we quietly pretend aren't there. All of them. The whole company. The whole strange, beautiful, slightly odd, contradictory assembly. And when every force has been met, when every voice has a proper place, something begins to become possible that just wasn't before. You stop using half your energy fighting yourself. You become less frightened of what might appear from the shadows because you've already started walking through them. And perhaps gradually the inner kingdom becomes a little more ordered, not perfect. I'm increasingly suspicious of perfection, but whole. And that, I think, is the great secret hidden inside the image of the spirits of the Brazen Vessel. Perhaps the spirits are never simply waiting for Solomon to command them. Perhaps they're waiting to be known. Perhaps the work for us is much the same, to turn towards the strange things we find within ourselves, to recognize them, to name them, to discover what they become when they are given their proper place. Because the thing we once feared as a demon may turn out to be something just very different when we finally meet it face to face. It might just be as simple as a forgotten part of ourselves, still carrying its piece of the temple and waiting for us to let it come home. Hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, share it, pass it around. Do subscribe to the channel if you've not already. The moment we hit 100 subscribers, we're going to start, I think, hopefully doing some live videos and chats as well. So see you next week for the Saturday Grove. Take care.